Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa. Now, Nigeria, as Africa's largest oil producer, aims to regain its victory as an agricultural powerhouse, albeit at a slow pace. Nigeria declined by 857 billion naira by the end of 2012. A call has been made to policymakers to show more commitment to strengthening the agriculture value chain. Our crew filed us this report.
There are a couple of things that they must address very quickly and decisively. One is land. In Nigeria today, all land is owned by the federal government. So really there are no titles to land. So somebody who wants to make a big investment to land, he is always scared as to what a certificate of occupancy means, and typically for any investor. And it's difficult to explain to those who do not reside here that a CFO is a pseudo title for land, and why is it for 25 years, why is it for 50 or 99 years. So they must sort out their land issues.
A study by the African Development Bank has it that agriculture accounts for about 40% of Nigeria's GDP. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria was one of the most promising agricultural producers in Africa before it turned to oil as its key economic component. Now the country is reforming its agricultural sector to bolster production and investment.
We recently relaunched the ASM platform, the Market for Small and Medium Enterprises. And we've always said that agriculture, with over 30% of GDP, should be a key area for us to attract companies. So what we're going to do, a key takeaway, is to go back and redouble our efforts to attract more companies into the ASM market as focused on the agriculture sector. The main board, we continue to talk to some of the big firms that operate in the agriculture space to also list on the main board. There are companies like Olam that the GSEC mentioned. We continue to talk to Notore, the fertilizer company. We're excited that there are a number of other fertilizer companies that are going to be coming on stream. And so they present credible targets to attract, to list on the exchange. So we'll redouble our efforts. I think the strategy is right. We are focusing our listing efforts on 4 sectors of the economy, and agriculture happens to be one of them.
However, indigenous players in Nigeria say that more needs to be done for the country to reach its agricultural potential.
Another thing that they must look into is taxation. Worldwide, wherever developing economies have made agriculture their priority, they've made agriculture tax-free. And that actually gives incentive, fiscal incentive, to business people to enter into agriculture. Because it is the only business where the outcome is dependent on many other factors which are not your making. So the risk being higher, you need that cover from the tax so that you conserve your revenue, you have reserves so that if there's a bad year, bad rainfall, bad whatever, storm or whatever, you still have some reserves to start again. So this is something that they must address, is taxation.
Nigeria, the world's second largest importer of rice, aims to become self-sufficient by 2015. However, business stressed that for that to happen, the country must tackle entrenched corruption, poor infrastructure, and underperforming government agencies. Philani Nyalunga, CNBC Africa, Johannesburg.
Now joining me in our Lagos studio to explore the agriculture business in Nigeria is Christopher Okeke, Executive Vice Chairman at Wicklow Group, and Kola Masha, CEO of Duro Partners. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join me. Now, let me start off with a question to you, Christopher. If we go back to the 1960s, before Nigeria turned to oil, we saw the country being one of the most promising agricultural producers in the world. What would you say then is responsible for the decline of that status, and so dramatically at that?
Thank you. I think it's important to stress that we were number 1 or number 2 in those crops that were grown in Nigeria, but you must remember that they were not food crops. They were plantation crops which were, I suppose, developed with a purpose in mind, to feed factories in England with raw material that was affordable. Consequently, the demise of that sort of agriculture and the lessening attraction of raw materials coming out of colonies meant that the the people of Nigeria who had not been farming for their own account on any sort of real scale were now left with something more attractive, I suppose, like oil, which seemed like an altogether easier way to do business. However, when you talk about the problems of agriculture today, it's well worth bearing in mind that there is not, in my view, a surfeit of experience. That is to say, dealing with agriculture in the way that we plan to now requires starting from scratch. And I think that's where we are today.
Kola, let me come to you. I first want to start off with whether you concur with Christopher's sentiments that to a large extent the state of the agricultural sector in Nigeria is because of a changing in global imbalances. Do you agree with that? But secondly, there's also been a contention that to a large extent it's the trade policies that Nigeria adopted in the late 70s and the early 80s that has somehow seen the death, if I may be as dramatic as that, of the agricultural sector. Where do you stand on why the agricultural sector is where it is at today?
Well, I think I must concur with many of the comments that Chris made. I think in addition to build on that, I think really comes down to Nigeria's ability to compete in the world from a productivity standpoint at the farm level. Where, in the 1960s, Nigeria could compete, but the reality is that over 20, 30 years, the rest of the world left Nigeria behind. You had scenarios where Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, their average yields on the key products that they grew went up 2, 3, 4, up to 5-fold in those 2-3 decades. While Nigeria, quite frankly, we stagnated. Our average yields across all major commodities that we've dealt with has grown basically less than 1% annually over the last 30 years.
I want to stay maybe with you, Kola, on this question. I want to look forward a little bit and touch on the investment platforms that are available for investors who want to get into public-private partnerships in Nigeria and make an investment into the agricultural sector. Are those platforms there?
Well, I think there are plans for those platforms to come in place. Whether they exist today, I think the reality is for individuals coming into the agriculture space, most players are doing it by themselves. I think the government has strategies that they plan to provide an enabling environment for the private sector to come in and play a role, but I think those are still in early days.
Christopher, how do we then move forward from what Kola says are strategies in place? How do we get from strategies to actual platforms, to actual implementation, and to actual investment?
Well, Kola said quite clearly there are strategies, but nothing's built on strategies. As Kola pointed out, everybody who's doing agriculture is doing it on his own steam. He's hoping and looking for opportunities to present themselves in due time when those strategies that he mentioned actually come into fruition. But I think it's also important to make the point that if the only basis for entering agriculture in Nigeria is on a PPP basis, then there's a problem, I think. Business, I think, is business. It isn't government business. And I think you come in and invest or not, and then you seek all those things that will make your investment easier. But I doubt that you can make it a condition for coming into Nigeria that you partner with government. I mean, that's strange economic logic, in my view.
Christopher, would you then agree with the sentiment that perhaps an alternative funding model right now, and maybe a more viable one, would be to look to the capital markets as a way of investors to get engaged in the agricultural sector?
Well, I believe that all those things condescend to what Kola said are strategies. It's going to be a while before agriculture that is required in this country reaches the stage where they will qualify for listing. The companies that have been mentioned, it's fair to say that they play in the sector, but I doubt that they are involved in the sector. I think Kola and I are particularly interested in building surpluses on the production side of things first, because that's what helps determines this much bandied value chain that everybody talks about. Without surpluses, I mean, there's a small engineering model which says input, process, output. Input here being produce. Unless you have that in surplus, it's unlikely that anything further down the line is going to work. And we hear about all sorts of interventions, but I think we miss the point. The value chain is a wonderful thing to describe, but everybody can pull it off the internet. If you want to work it in this environment, you need to step back and start from the first link. Because without that, and a true understanding of that, the rest of it is hot air, frankly.
Now, Kola, let me come back to you. Earlier, when we were watching the clip, we heard a rather amazing statement, and that statement is, all land is owned by the federal government. Is this a reflection of the truth in Nigeria? Is this accurate?
Well, I think Chris it would, from a legal standpoint, yes, that is the fact. Now the reality, though, is that that land is also owned in the true sense by communities. And so when you actually are looking to acquire land in Nigeria, and Chris has done this very extensively, it's almost a twofold approach. You have to work with government, but at the end of the day, government with you or you independently will go and work with the communities that actually reside on that land, work that land, to be able to get access to it.
Chris, let's bring it back to you then, since it seems as if you're the guy with the experience on the ground, having worked with communities. Talk us through the ease of getting land ownership in Nigeria for somebody who wants to go into the sector, and not necessarily a foreign investor, but maybe somebody who hasn't traditionally been a part of the agricultural activity. Is it a fairly seamless process to get those land titles in place?
I think Kola made the point, but it's important to clarify. Before 1978, land was held by families, by individuals, by communities, in much the same way as it's held everywhere where we had the English common law. In 1978, the federal government, in its wisdom, sought to make life easier, quote unquote, and because those negotiations could be protracted, could be nerve-wracking, and they thought, here's one quick way to resolve this matter. We, government, hold in trust for everybody in Nigeria. We, government, issue you a certificate of occupancy over that piece of land, and that's the title that you're looking for. Because it's not called a conveyance or a deed of this or that, does not change its efficacy in law. It is a title document, the C of O. Now, as to how you would go about doing it, Kola's mentioned that because families and communities resided on these vast areas of land before 1978, it's fair to say that the assumption remains that it belongs to them. Now, as a prudent operator, you go where your first host is, and you make sure that he's satisfied. And then you both go to the big host, who is the head lessor, so to speak, and seek his consent. That's all you get from the government. So the government is not holding it to say they give to whom they like. No, you come to government and say, we have a transaction covering X hundred hectares. Please authenticate that transaction. Give us a negotiable instrument that will aid the use of this instrument as security for a bank loan, for whatever else you wanted to do.
Christopher,
so that's basically what it is.
Christopher, before we go to a quick ad break, would you say that the allegations of corruption in land law in Nigeria are exaggerated?
I think it's very safe to assume that people who do not understand it may look at it and see that it's different from what they're used to. But I hesitate to point fingers at anybody and say there is corruption in land law or in land titles or in the business of land. If it exists, I doubt that it exists more or less than the major problems that we have with corruption. But those are isolated matters. And as Kola said, I've been in land in Nigeria for 43 years. I think that I have fairly good experience about dealing with land matters, and I don't believe that if you look through my records, you would find graft as a part of my cost profile, and that's fact.